July 5, 1943. In the rolling wheat fields around the Russian city of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history was about to begin. Nearly 6,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, and over 2 million soldiers would clash in a titanic struggle that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front and ultimately seal Nazi Germany's doom. The Battle of Kursk would become the watershed moment of World War II in the East, the point where Nazi Germany's Eastern offensive power was broken forever, and the Red Army began its inexorable march toward Berlin. But this story begins 6 months earlier, in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, where the German war machine suffered its first catastrophic defeat. By February 1943, the German Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad, and the myth of German invincibility lay shattered in the rubble. The Soviets, sensing opportunity, launched a massive winter offensive that pushed the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles. But in a brilliant tactical counterstroke, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein orchestrated a counteroffensive that recaptured Kharkov in March and stabilized the front. This left a massive bulge, a salient in the Soviet lines centered on the city of Kursk. The salient protruded 120 miles into German-held territory and was 200 miles wide. To German commanders, it looked like a massive opportunity. To Soviet commanders, it looked like a trap waiting to be sprung. Adolf Hitler became obsessed with eliminating the Kursk salient. Operation Citadel, as the offensive was codenamed, would be the last major German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Hitler delayed the operation repeatedly, waiting for new wonder weapons, the Tiger and Panther tanks, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, the FW-190 fighter aircraft. He believed these technological marvels would offset Soviet numerical superiority. But every day of delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. And prepare they did. Thanks to the Lucy spy ring and British intelligence sharing ultra intercepts, Soviet commanders knew exactly where and when the Germans would strike. They turned the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history. Under the direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the architect of the Stalingrad victory, the Soviets created a defensive system of staggering depth and complexity. They constructed 8 defensive belts extending up to 190 miles deep. Over 300,000 civilians dug anti-tank ditches, laid nearly 1 million mines, and built thousands of fortified positions. The forward defenses alone contained 1,500 anti-tank strongpoints and 1,700 anti-tank guns. Behind these positions sat massive artillery concentrations and tank reserves. The Soviets massed 1.3 million men in the salient itself, with another 500,000 in strategic reserve. They had 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2,650 aircraft. The Soviet strategy was deliberately defensive. Unlike previous battles where Stalin had demanded immediate counterattacks, Zhukov convinced him to let the Germans exhaust themselves against prepared defenses. The Red Army would absorb the German assault, bleed the panzer divisions white, then launch massive counteroffensives when the Germans were weakest. Every detail was planned. Artillery registered on likely German assembly areas. Tank crews trained on mock-ups of Tiger and Panther tanks. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft practice anti-tank tactics. Soviet intelligence even identified the exact day and hour the German offensive would begin. The trap was set. The Germans, meanwhile, assembled a massive striking force. Army Group South under Manstein concentrated 1,500 tanks, including 200 Tigers and Panthers. Army Group Center under Klug massed another 1,200 tanks. In total, nearly 900,000 German troops, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft prepared to smash through the Soviet defenses and encircle the Kursk salient. Hitler proclaimed that Citadel would be a victory that would shine like a beacon to the world. But some German commanders were less optimistic. Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of panzer warfare, argued the operation would squander Germany's last armored reserves for no strategic gain. He was overruled. At 4:30 a.m. on July 5, 1943, the Germans launched Operation Citadel. But the Soviets had one final surprise. Soviet artillery opened fire 15 minutes before the German assault, catching German troops in their assembly areas. The Germans recovered and attacked anyway. In the south, Manstein's forces struck with tremendous power. The 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf drove into the Soviet defenses. Tiger tanks led the assault, their 80mm guns destroying T-34s at ranges where Soviet tanks couldn't return fire. But the Tigers advanced slowly, and the Soviets had prepared for them. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth opened fire. Mines destroyed tracks. Soviet Sturmovix dove on the advancing German columns. The German advance was measured in miles per day, not miles per hour as in previous offensives. Every Soviet defensive belt had to be fought through at terrible cost. The new Panther tanks, rushed into service before proper testing, suffered mechanical breakdowns. Of 200 Panthers committed to battle, only 40 were operational after the first day. But Manstein's troops were veterans of 3 years of Eastern Front combat, and they ground forward relentlessly. By July 10th, they had penetrated 25 miles into the Soviet defenses, but this was exactly what Zhukov had anticipated. The Germans were being channeled toward the small town of Prokhorovka, where Soviet tank armies waited in concealment. In the north, the attack stalled almost immediately. Model's 9th Army attacked the Soviet Central Front with 200 tanks and assault guns, but the Soviet defenses proved impenetrable. The Ferdinand tank destroyer, Hitler's technological wonder, proved a disaster. Heavily armored but lacking machine guns, they were vulnerable to Soviet infantry anti-tank teams. Soviet anti-tank ditches channeled German armor into kill zones where massed anti-tank guns waited. After 5 days of brutal fighting, Model's forces had advanced only 6 miles and lost over 25,000 men and 200 tanks. The northern pincer of the German offensive was broken. In the south, however, Manstein's panzers were still driving toward Prokhorovka. July 12, 1943. Near the small railway station of Prokhorovka, the greatest tank battle in history reached its climax. The German 2 SS Panzer Corps, 3 elite SS Panzer divisions with over 400 tanks, prepared to break through the last Soviet defensive belt. But Marshal Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, with over 850 tanks, had moved into position during the night. At dawn, under cover of a Soviet artillery barrage, Rotmistrov ordered his T-34s forward at maximum speed. The Soviet tankers had learned that closing rapidly negated the German advantage in long-range firepower. If they could get within 100 meters, a T-34's gun could penetrate a Tiger's armor. What followed was mechanized warfare at its most brutal. Over 200 tanks and assault guns fought at point-blank range in an area of barely 10 square miles. The battlefield disappeared in smoke and dust. Tanks collided with each other. Crews fired at ranges measured in meters. The temperature inside the tanks reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition exploded. Fuel tanks ignited. The earth shook with the concussion of thousands of shells. German Tigers destroyed multiple T-34s each, but the Soviets kept coming in waves, overwhelming German positions through sheer numbers. The battle raged for 12 hours. By evening, the field was littered with hundreds of burning tanks, the largest tank graveyard in history. Soviet losses were catastrophic, over 300 tanks destroyed, but the German advance was stopped. The Secker's SS Panzer Corps had lost 70 tanks and assault guns, modest compared to Soviet losses, but irreplaceable for the Wehrmacht. More critically, the Corps had lost momentum and suffered heavy personnel casualties. That same day, Hitler received news that the Allies had landed in Sicily. German reserves earmarked for Kursk were now needed in Italy. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. For the first time in the war, a major German summer offensive had been stopped cold without achieving a breakthrough. The tide on the Eastern Front had turned irreversibly. The Soviets didn't wait to savor their defensive victory. On July 12th, even as tanks burned at Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German forces that had attacked from the north. 3 Soviet fronts, over 1.2 million men, smashed into the flanks of Model's exhausted Ninth Army. By July 15th, they had liberated Orel. 5 days later, the Soviets launched Operation Rumyantsev in the south, targeting Kharkov. The city that had changed hands 4 times in the war fell to the Red Army on August 23rd. The Soviet offensives that followed Kursk would continue without pause until they reached Berlin 21 months later. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions, the elite striking force of the German military, had been shattered. In 6 weeks of fighting, the Germans lost over 200,000 casualties, 1,600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,000 aircraft. More importantly, they had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front forever. Hitler admitted in a staff meeting, "The failure of Citadel is a decisive defeat. From now on, the enemy will have the initiative." German commanders pleaded for permission to conduct elastic defense, trading space for time. Hitler refused, ordering troops to hold every meter of ground. This inflexibility would cost Germany dearly in the campaigns to come. Soviet losses were even higher in absolute numbers: 860,000 casualties, 6,000 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft. But the Soviet Union could replace these losses. Its factories in the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers, were producing 2,000 tanks per month. American Lend-Lease was delivering thousands of trucks, enabling Soviet mechanization. New tank armies were being formed. The Red Army was learning the sophisticated operational art that would carry it to Berlin. Most crucially, Soviet soldiers now knew they could defeat the Wehrmacht in open battle. The psychological impact was profound. The aura of German invincibility was gone. Kursk was a laboratory of armored warfare. The battle demonstrated that prepared defenses in depth could stop even the most powerful armored offensive. The Soviets proved that tactical intelligence, knowing when and where the enemy would attack, was as important as numerical superiority. Their defensive doctrine, absorbing the attack and then counterattacking, became the model for Soviet operations for the rest of the war. The Germans learned the hard way that technological superiority couldn't overcome massive material inferiority. Tigers and Panthers were magnificent weapons individually, but they couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers to offset Soviet mass production of adequate weapons like the T-34. The battle also demonstrated the importance of air power in land warfare. Soviet aviation, long the poor relation of the Red Army, had achieved parity with the Luftwaffe. The Sturmovik ground attack aircraft proved devastatingly effective against German armor. Soviet fighters contested German air superiority, forcing Luftwaffe units into defensive operations. German air losses were severe, with irreplaceable, experienced pilots lost. The Luftwaffe would never again dominate the skies over the Eastern Front. This air parity enabled Soviet ground forces to operate without the constant threat of German air attack that had hampered them in 1941 and 1942. For tank tactics, Kursk demonstrated the value of combined arms integration. Soviet success came not just from tanks, but from coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, and aviation. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth channeled German armor into kill zones. Infantry with anti-tank rifles disabled tank tracks, immobilizing Tigers for artillery to destroy. Engineers laid minefields that slowed German advances to a crawl. The Soviets were becoming masters of the operational art, the ability to coordinate multiple armies across hundreds of miles to achieve strategic objectives. This skill would be on full display in the massive offensives that liberated Soviet territory in 1944. In the strategic calculus of World War II, Kursk was the moment when Germany's defeat became inevitable. Before Kursk, the Germans might have stabilized the Eastern Front, traded space for time, and negotiated a settlement. After Kursk, the only question was when Germany would be defeated, not if. The battle demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved from the disorganized force that nearly collapsed in 1941 into a sophisticated military machine capable of defeating the Wehrmacht in any kind of warfare, offensive or defensive, mobile or positional. Soviet commanders like Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky proved themselves the equals of their German counterparts in operational skill. The victory at Kursk had profound effects on Soviet morale and international standing. Stalin's position was strengthened. He was no longer the dictator who had nearly lost the war through his purges and poor military judgment in 1941, but the leader who had orchestrated the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union's prestige among the Allies increased dramatically. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, Stalin negotiated from a position of strength, extracting commitments from Roosevelt and Churchill about the post-war order. The balance of power in Europe was shifting. The Red Army that would liberate Eastern Europe would also occupy it, setting the stage for the Cold War. Today, the fields around Kursk are peaceful, but the earth still yields relics of the battle, shell fragments, tank parts, even unexploded ordnance. Memorials mark where the great tank battles raged. Veterans, their numbers dwindling with each year, return to remember fallen comrades. The Battle of Kursk represents the Red Army's finest hour, the moment when the Soviet Union, despite suffering the most devastating invasion in history, stopped the Wehrmacht's last offensive and began the long march to Berlin. It was the largest tank battle ever fought, and likely the last time armor would clash on such a massive scale. In the annals of military history, Kursk stands as the battle that broke the back of Nazi Germany's Eastern Army.